Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 236 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Today on the show, we'll be discussing the January 2017 issue of Wired, which is the magazine's first ever fiction issue. And I'm joined by two guests. So first up, we've got Maria Streshinsky. She's the features editor for Wired magazine, and has also been deputy editor of Mother Jones, editor-in-chief of Pacific Standard, and managing editor of The Atlantic. Pacific Standard won a National Magazine Award for Public Service in 2014 for a cover story that Maria edited, and in 2009 she received the Atlantic Media Company Chairman's Award for Editing Excellence. She also spent 2 years working at the U.S. Department of the Interior. So Maria, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
And also joining us today is Jason Kehe. He's an associate editor at Wired, focusing on front-of-book stories and features. Before joining Wired, he was a freelance journalist and arts critic. So, Jason, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. Happy to be here. I'm so surprised you got my last name right. How did you know?
I looked at your Twitter account. So.
Nice.
Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is just how this special issue came about. And so, Jason, do you want to just talk about what the initial idea was in the early meetings?
Sure, I can try. So Caitlyn Roper was a senior editor at Wired, and it was always sort of her pet project to do a fiction issue. She came from Paris Review, where she was managing editor, and always wanted to bring some fiction flavor to Wired magazine. So her idea was to do a full issue takeover of fiction. Of course, I'm speaking of her in the past tense because she left Wired to go to New York Times Magazine right in the middle of the process. And up until that point, it was really entirely her show. She kind of wanted to single-handedly work on the issue because she knows a lot of agents, she knows a lot of writers from her days in New York at the Paris Review. So I can't entirely speak to her original source of inspiration. I shouldn't speak for her. But I can say I was in a lot of those early meetings where we were getting submissions and evaluating various writers and directions we wanted to go, and we kind of came up with the idea that we wanted these stories to be just a notch into the future, not crazy, 500 years off, but take something that's sort of familiar to our world and our readers and spin it forward just a bit, and imagine a scenario where the world or various communities are dealing with a tech innovation that would fundamentally change their lives.
Right, so you said that Caitlyn had kind of been wanting to do this for a while. What was it about this moment that you think made it happen?
Well, this was certainly long before any of us thought Trump would be president, so that really had no bearing at the time and that'll become relevant a little later, and Maria, I think, can speak to that better. But I think we wanted kind of a big, ambitious issue around the holidays that people could read, over the break. And the idea of sitting down with a whole issue of fiction stories seemed to make a lot of sense. So Caitlyn started planning this, I want to say, probably a year ago, knowing that it would be for the January issue of 2017. So I think that was kind of the inspiration there, just to do something different, something we'd never done before. Caitlyn also edited our first sex issue. So she had this kind of big picture thinking where with Wired she wanted to do really ambitious things.
Right, and so you said that she had all these connections in the literary world. And so when you came onto this project, did you have any connections to the literary world, or how involved were you in written science fiction?
Certainly far fewer than Caitlyn. She knows everybody in publishing, really. But I guess I brought an affinity for genre, and Caitlyn is a bit more of a generalist when it comes to her literary taste. And I've been reading science fiction and fantasy since I was reading at all. So I suppose I helped pick out writers that maybe Caitlyn had less familiarity with when it came to genre. And K. Jemisin obviously would be one. We had chosen her, Jemisin, that is, for our first Wired book club, and that sort of turned Caitlyn on to her, and then she started reading her, and we eventually ended up publishing her in the issue.
And so, Maria, what stage in the process did you get involved?
Right. So I think the pieces were all coming in draft form right when I arrived at the magazine. And pretty soon after we learned that Caitlyn was leaving. And I had actually produced all of the fiction issues at The Atlantic when I was at The Atlantic, with Mike Curtis, who was our longtime editor there, did all of the selection. But so Caitlyn kind of leaned to me and said, when we found out that she was leaving, she just asked if I could help shepherd the whole thing together. And at that point, pick up the drafts and working with the editors and pull it all together. And it also meant, working really closely with the art department, which is something that was great fun for this issue. And we could talk about it a little bit more, as
Maria,
well.
I sorry to
Go ahead.
interrupt, but I'm just curious, since I've never asked you this, the difference between editing fiction at The Atlantic and at Wired.
Not much, actually. I mean, I think that we could talk about the topic of editing fiction, which I think makes a lot of nonfiction editors scratch their head at times. But really, I think is one of those kind of pure arts in that you see these pieces come in and you can just kind of see where the author is trying to go, and oftentimes they really get there, and you can see moments where the reader may be confused and that what you see is the rhythm of the piece hits some hiccups. And so to me, the editing of this kind of fiction just came down to the same thing in both places, where you just want to make sure that the reader stays along with the writer the whole time. A lot of that work is just done in the early stages of accepting the stories and choosing the right stories for the mix.
I mean, all the stories I think are about 3,000 words or less. Was there a strict word limit for what people could turn in?
No, not really. We wanted a couple really flash fiction-y type pieces. So Charlie Jane's piece, for instance, I think is only 800 words or something. And then we had one piece that came in closer to 8,000 or something, but that was far too long for an issue like this. So yeah, I think we kind of maxed out around 3,000. That's just sort of the length that made sense for the issue. But Maria, does that sound right to you?
Yeah, that does. I mean, it was really fun to see the range of lengths and that all these stories worked at their lengths. I mean, again, as Jason mentioned, we had to ask the authors to trim a couple of the really long ones down because there's always the moment of producing a print magazine where you only have so many pages. And we wanted to be sure we had a robust mix and that we had a robust variety of places that the authors could go. But we really didn't have to do a whole lot of, I mean, the authors really did it beautifully for us.
Nora.
Yeah, go ahead.
Nora's piece came in at around, I think, 5,000 words. But I asked her up front if she could cut it down to 3, which she did. And I would like to think she and I both agree that the piece works better at the length. And with all the pieces that had to be cut, as is so often the case with cutting, I think it really improves the piece and you lose some of the extraneous bits and you can focus the themes better. So I'm really glad with the length for all the pieces, and I don't think anyone felt like they were losing the story that they originally wanted to tell. I actually think all the pieces work better at the lengths that they ran at.
I mean, like, Maria, did you have experience editing science fiction before, or was this something new for you?
Oh gosh, not at all. I mean, this is the funny thing about this, and I guess I'm gonna admit, open a vein or something here, that I didn't have much experience with science fiction in the least, and it's something I now want to read a lot more of. I mean, I've read various bits and, probably the classics at times in my life. But it's not the genre that has been my go-to. And the thing that I just found so sort of beautiful, about this process was that you look at the pieces and it really does just become about, it seems like it's so much just about the reader. I mean, everything we edit really is at the end of the day about the reader and about the reader's understanding. But this just kind of is like this beautiful stripped down process where the author wants to get a story told that has an arc, that starts somewhere and goes somewhere. And all we wanted to do was help them do that in a way that stuck to their prose and their thinking, and helped get the reader to where we could see the authors were going. And again, I think both Jason and I sound maybe a little more heavy-handed than I think it was, in talking about this. Like, it really was what he's saying about just maybe shaping that sentence because that sentence didn't seem to flow, or, there would be a moment that in a piece that just felt perhaps a little bit off the path that we were going on. But in the end, I guess what I'm trying to say is I had not touched science fiction barely at all, and I still found it to be just the sort of same beautiful process. And I, to be clear, I didn't really edit fiction that much at the Atlantic because my role was more of a get the pieces in from Mike Curtis, help polish them, help them get through our copy edit and fact checking process, which yes, we do fact check fiction, and we did here too, and just make sure that the pieces went out to the readers as cleanly and crisply as they could.
I mean, are there any examples of factual mistakes that you're really glad that you caught in the fact checking process?
This time we did not have any. The things we stumbled on this time and that we talked through would be like the James S.A. Corey. Those guys used real names to real cities that exist in the world, and yet sometimes the fact checkers would say, well, this real city isn't anything like this city they're describing, but the authors are using real locations. So is it okay that the real location would never be this kind of place? And, most of those things we sort of just all decided that's fine. This is fiction. This is fiction and fantasy. But actually, the authors at times were great about saying, you're right. Let's change that to a different name of a different city or something like that.
And I will add on N.K. Jemison's piece again, and I apologize for keep bringing it up, but it's one I'm so proud of.
It's such a great piece.
It's so much fun. Our assistant research editor, she fact-checked all of the date time stamps on each of those transmissions, and she said after she did that, they were all correct, by the way. Nora hadn't made any mistakes, which isn't surprising. She's incredibly meticulous. But Lexi said after fact-checking all of those date and time stamps, a whole new elements of the story came out, and she was able to piece things together that she hadn't before, which is such a trademark of hard science fiction. This extra layer that, if you really scrutinize it, reveals kind of a deeper, fuller meaning.
I love that detail when Lexi told me that too. I think, every reader, if they get a chance now, should go back and look at all those incredibly detailed little date stamps that run through the Jemison piece. That piece is so thought-provoking and kind of horrifying in a great way when you kind of get it, when it unfolds and you see what's happening.
Right. It's one of those pieces that, I've read it probably 10, 15 times by now, and I'm still getting things out of it every time I read it. So I hope people, even if they don't get it the first time, sit back down and read through it again, and then maybe on their third or fourth read, look at those date times or look at other elements that she's snuck in, because there are so many little hidden bits that I feel like you really couldn't see until you've read it 4 or 5 times, which is really amazing.
I mean, do you want to just say basically what the premise of the story is?
Sure. This is set, probably it's our furthest into the future. The globe is suffering from overpopulation, so we have to trade with aliens. And so it's told through a series of radio transmissions from many light years away. So there are bits and pieces of these transmissions that have been garbled or lost, and a computer is trying to optimize those moments. But you're only getting snippets of transcripts or team logs or reports from these trade missions. And so it's sort of a mission gone slightly wrong. And I don't want to say anything more than that, because the joy in the piece and the horror, as Maria said, is in the discovery of what exactly is going on in this mission.
Well, I mean, Jason, you mentioned earlier that you didn't know that Trump was going to be president when you initially conceived this issue. Were the stories, when the authors wrote the stories, did they know that, or were they written before that?
Well, I think Maria should speak to this because, it's a fascinating conversation, but I think Maria can speak more articulately.
Oh, okay, yeah, sure.
Well, either of us, Jason. So, the magazine was planned a year ago, and the folks at Wired at the time, Jason and a small team, started reaching out to authors they loved and calling for stories. And nobody had the time. I mean, we were in the thick of a terrible election, but nobody knew which way it was going to go. But interestingly enough, when you do look back to when we started calling for stories, we were still in the primaries. Trump kept beating all of these other 16 or 18 or 300 other people in the Republican primary. And I think that there was moments along that, if you track it back, there were probably moments along there where people really were nervous of the Trump rise, or happy, depending on which side of the aisle you fall on. And so I don't know. I mean, I wish I could say that some of our authors, saw the Trump rise and kind of worked it into their pieces or their pitches. I could certainly reverse engineer such a storyline. But in the end, I think we were working and polishing these pieces when we all thought Hillary was going to win. And I think it's a fair thing to say, because I think even Trump thought Hillary was going to win, or Clinton was going to win. So it's just been such an interesting arc. And there were many weeks in there where we were looking at this package of stories, and so many of them were grasping onto themes of national anxiety or international world anxieties, overpopulation, like Jason mentioned, natural resource depletion, the rise of technology sort of taking over our minds and our thoughts. And so when we looked at the package altogether, we got a little bit worried that, this is a pretty dark view of the future if you take them as a whole. But the national conversation was dark and scary, and it ended up tracking. I mean, we really do. Wired really wants to be able to look forward and look at where there are optimistic ideas and people championing optimistic notions of the future. I mean, we did it we had President Obama guest edit the issue because of his view that we are living in the best times and that things can only get better, or, have a real chance to get better. But in the end, those collection of pieces did really reflect a kind of national anxiety that all came true. So, and as we were building it, as Scott says in his editor's letter, it's really hard to know what the future holds right now. We were putting this together at a time when it was very hard to say, we are going to have an optimistic future. And so the package ended up really reflecting that national psyche. And then, of course, as Trump won, it felt even more on the nose, because it is not an extension of what we have all been used to. It is the election is a complete upending of what, the things we had come to be used to in the last 8 years.
Right. Well, you mentioned that a lot of these stories involve ecological collapse, and one that really stands out in that regard for me is The Great Dying by Lydia Millett. And I wasn't too familiar with her before reading this story, but I guess she's actually a conservationist. I don't know if you guys know her at all, or...
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Conservationist. I think she's been nominated for 2 Pulitzers. And since editing her, I've, of course, read her book, and I've forced her latest on Maria, which I don't think she's read it yet.
Not yet. But, it's on my stack.
And she's tremendous. I mean, I feel like, that was a Caitlyn connection. I think she may know Lydia Millett, and I inherited that piece when Caitlyn left, and working with her was really wonderful. That piece came in. It was a chapter from her only young adult book, Pills and Starships, and I think it's the first chapter, and it was 8,000 words or something, which was far too long for anything we had planned. But in a matter of 2 days or something, we had cut it down from 8,000 words to the version that ran on Wire.com, which is, I think, around 3,000, maybe even less. And we were both so happy with how it came out, because it really focused it into something that could stand alone as a short story, as opposed to an excerpt from a longer book.
Right, and so the premise here is that it's sort of like Soylent Green a little bit, where the future ecology is so devastated that people are just choosing to check themselves into voluntary suicide centers.
Right.
This was making me think of, actually, when my parents were in college, they went to see a double feature of Soylent Green and Silent Running, and they were so traumatized by it that they came home and joined the Sierra Club and Planned Parenthood that night.
That's wonderful.
But so I don't know if
David, I'd be interested. Did you think that the piece worked as a sort of standalone story? Do you want to read the book? What was your sort of impression reading it?
Yeah, no, I thought it worked as a standalone story. I mean, I guess I saw that it was part of a book in the
Right.
author's note, but I thought it worked just fine as a, sort of a slice of this future world. And there is kind of an arc involved. I don't want to say too much, but there is kind of an arc involving the characters. So I thought it worked, yeah, as a standalone piece just fine.
Mm-hmm.
I guess, are there any other, so the ecological collapse, that was one theme, obviously, that jumps out at you from these stories. Were there any other themes that were in common among multiple stories that really jumped out at you as you were looking them over?
You know, what's interesting is that one of the things we struggled with is we only, again, I think I said this before, but we only had so many pages, and we had more pieces that we loved that we could fit in the print magazine. But one of the things we had to do was realize that we actually had 2 pieces about clones. We had 3 pieces about climate change.
Set on islands, yeah.
Right. And so we started to look at, maybe, and most of our readers come to us online, so we moved some of them. We didn't want to get rid of any, so we moved a couple of those over to online only. But the 2 pieces about clones was an interesting take.
Right. And on climate change, it was sort of gratifying, I suppose, in hindsight. That's 3 of these writers focused on global warming and climate change, only because it's suddenly it's even more important of an issue. And I think our February essay is on climate change. So it was not surprising, and I think fiction in particular will really need to engage with climate change, and I think that's a smart way to get more people talking about it. We just did, for book club, Jeff Vandermeer's Southern Reach trilogy, and he was talking about how people complain there isn't a lot of good climate fiction, cli-fi, it's sometimes called, but that's not true, and that I think our issue sort of reflects that a lot of genre writers in particular do want to tackle changing climates as themes in their stories. So the fact that we have 3 pieces that touch on that, to me, simply emphasizes the fact that it's a really important time in genre fiction to address these issues.
Yeah, well, Maria mentioned the clone stories, and I really thought the L7 gene was a really interesting premise. Could you talk about that?
Sure, I edited that and was a really big champion for that piece. The premise alone was enough, I think, to sell it, at least to me. You essentially, the main character, Sam, arrives home for Thanksgiving and has realized she's trans, realizes that her mother has cloned her but removed the gene in the clone that makes you trans, so she now has a brother who's teenage, and she's, I suppose, in her 20s. And just how do you deal with the fact that mom has cloned you but made you the version of yourself that you don't feel that you are? So it was, Jean's premise was so smart, and that then the story sort of proceeds from there.
I mean, did you talk to the author at all about where the story came from or what she was going for or anything like that?
Oh yeah, certainly. I mean, the first conversation was really interesting for that reason. And what I also found interesting was that she had written this story a couple of years ago, I want to say, and struggled to place it anywhere. And she was explaining to me that not a lot of places she felt understood it or got what she was trying to do. And there's a lot of layers to the story, and Maria and I spent a lot of time thinking about it and working with her on editing it, because we really wanted it to be clear what she was going for, but at the same time preserve some of the ambiguity in those family dynamics. And there's a question in the end, I don't think this is spoiling too much, about what Sam, the main character, does to the brother. I'm trying to be intentionally vague. And it's sort of up to the reader to decide, but Jean and I had talked through it, and she had very clear ideas for what actually happens after the story ends. But we didn't want it to be so obvious that there was only one interpretation. So a lot of the story is about deciding for yourself who's right. Is Sam right to be angry at her mom? Is her mom right for doing this to Sam? And what's love, and what are these mother-daughter relationships supposed to mean? So yeah, there's a lot of intentional ambiguity built into the piece, which made it both a challenge and a pleasure to work on.
Well, and it seems like the broader the technology of being able to dictate the gender or sexual identity of your children is probably something that is going to happen within a couple of decades, right? Did you guys talk at all about how concerned you are about this actually happening?
Oh yeah, I mean, part of the theme of the piece is that once you figure out one thing, that opens up this terrible slippery slope for everything else. So, I think there may be a line, or it's a bit vague, it's supposed to be, that the mom suggests that, now that she's isolated this so-called L7 gene, you could potentially isolate any other gene for skin color or for really anything else. And how that will be a reality at some point, and we'll have to face the consequences of that. But Jean and I agree that any kind of manipulation at this genetic level is sort of monstrous. But we don't want to get too preachy or heavy-handed in the story. That those themes are supposed to come out naturally.
Let me add something to that. It was really interesting working with Jason, and I didn't work directly with Jean, but Jason did. But just on that piece, because some of the things I would push on, Jean was very clear about her perspective, and that perspective was very important. And I really appreciated that. And I think, as a trans woman, that was incredibly valuable, and it comes out in the piece nicely. She actually had, very clear moments of wanting something to be phrased a very specific way because of her own experience.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it came down to individual word choices that we might push back on because it seemed odd or unclear, but Jean would very adamantly say, and I really respected her for pushing back, that this is trying to do something very particular to my experience. And so, that's why I phrase it this way, or that's why you're supposed to be confused. You're supposed to feel the kind of ambiguity or something like that. I'm really proud that we have the piece. It's one of my favorites.
Well, so Maria, Jason has mentioned working closely with a couple of these authors. Are there any authors that you worked particularly closely with that stick out?
The only piece that I worked directly with the author, there were two. I took over the James S.A. Corey piece from Rob because he was too busy, but was Etgar Keret's piece, which is it's called A. And that piece, again, it's one of these stories that I really don't want to give away the ending, because the ending is such a, a surprise, a twist. But Etgar Keret is Israeli. He does, a lot of fiction. You might have heard him on This American Life a number of times. And it was so interesting and fun to work with him because he too was incredibly specific about where he wanted his words to go. And he was also working through a translator, Sandra Silverstone, because English is not his first or preferred language. But so that piece is about this seemingly orphanage where these children are left because they have this supposed disease that makes them grow 10 times faster than humans, and so they become essentially fully adults probably in about 10 years, but then they die, and it unravels from there. And it too has so many themes that are tied through it, and some obscurity that you really understand at the end of the piece, but it doesn't throw you as a reader on the way. It's been fun to work through these pieces and have other editors at Wired read them at times just for proofreading and have them say which ones were their favorites. One of our editors in New York, just the Keret piece was absolutely his favorite. So
I think that was our first green light too. Sorry to interrupt.
It's hard. It's actually no, it's okay. It's a little hard to talk about because I really would love to talk about the ending and I don't want to give it away. But talking about the ending kind of lets me unfold the whole story. Because the ending has kind of a double backflip twist on it. And actually, a version of this story Etgar started with had the ending going the opposite way that it goes now, which if I knew all the listeners had read the piece, then we could all talk about, but I can't do it yet.
Well, no, that was super interesting to me because I had read Caitlyn, like I said, I think Caitlyn greenlit this piece and Matt Gallagher's piece first. So those were the first two stories that we knew we would run. And I had read Ecker's treatment for this story, so he'd only had kind of a plot summary and outline at that point. And the ending was sort of the exact opposite as what it ended up being. And I wasn't involved in the editing, and maybe he at some point during the writing process realized the ending had to be different. But
he did.
that was really
he
fascinating.
Did. And actually, that is what happened. I sent him back some notes on the first draft, and the only notes were really about the omniscient narrator and kind of switch that happens in the piece, and really then just some other very small stuff, because of translation, and I wanted to be sure that his meaning was coming through. But I had a question for him on the ending, and he came back and went the entirely other way and said, I think your questions were really thoughtful, and you made me, think, but the ending has to be, and again, 180 degrees. This is how it has to go. And so,
so I suppose that's an instance where the editing did really fundamentally change part of the story.
Well, I actually think it was mostly him and not me. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think that I was just asking some questions, and he then said, well, he has realized,
right.
Sort of aside from my questions, he has realized that the piece only works if this thing happens.
See, have you guys ever heard Edgar Carrett's story about how he got started writing?
Oh, no, I need to listen.
No, me neither.
Oh, it's a great story. Yeah, so I saw him at an event years ago, and I heard him tell this story. But because especially when he started, all his stories were very, very short. I mean, like 2 pages long. And so he was explaining why he wrote such short stories. And it was because he was drafted into the Israeli military. Everyone has to do like
right.
compulsory service. And since he was such a poor soldier, they found the most like easy, unuseful job for him, which was he had to sit in the basement with this big supercomputer, and there was a phone. And if the computer stopped running, he was supposed to call someone. And that was his whole job. And so he was just sitting there and his shift was from like midnight to 6 a.m. or something like that. And so he was just sitting there at this computer, and he's like, I wonder if like there's I could do anything on this computer. He's like, well, I can like type, do word processing. So he said, maybe I'll write a story. And it had to be a story that he could finish before 6 a.m., so it had to be pretty short. And so he wrote this story, and he printed it out, and he's like, I think this is pretty good. He's like, I want to show this story to somebody, but who's around at 6 a.m. that I can show my story to? So he called up his brother, and his brother says, well, I'm about to take my dog out for a walk. So, come over and I'll read the story while we walk my dog. And so Edgar's like, all right. So he goes over and he gives the story to his brother, and they go and walk the dog, and his brother reads the story. And he says, could you print out another copy of this? And Edgar is really happy. He's like, yeah, of course I could. And the brother says, great. And he uses this story to pick up the dog poop.
Oh, no. Oh, no.
And that's how he got started as a writer.
Oh, no. That is a wonderful story.
I think Caitlyn was an early champion of Edgar Carrett's.
Oh, yeah.
Published him at the Paris Review. So she's known him for many years. So he was definitely one of the first people she reached out to. And he submitted 2 pieces for consideration, actually, and the other one ended up running in BuzzFeed, I want to say. It was sort of tied to Pokemon Go in that moment, and we thought the piece that ran in Wired was the better fit for what we were trying to do, but he's fabulous.
Well, so Maria, you mentioned you also worked on the James S.A. Corey story. You want to talk about that one?
Yeah, that piece, the more I read it, and again, our notes back to the authors were just actually tightening. Those guys have this beautiful prose. They're very, I don't want to use earnest in a bad way, earnest in a really lovely way. And they spin out scene, and you really know where you're standing on the street with the protagonist. And so most of our notes to them were about keeping the reader clear that we're now standing on the street instead of in the room that we were just in, stuff like that. Or that we've moved down the street and, now we're sitting with a different character. And it was really interesting to see the pushback again on a couple of things where I have this great document back from them where it says, stat for author voice in a few moments, which was really, fun and funny. And I thought, right, that's their voice. It's not my voice. Maybe I, overstepped in a couple of spots. Again, it was all pretty small stuff. But when you think there was this moment a couple months back where people started talking about the idea of basic income again. And, the ideas and the fights and the arguments for and against basic income, usually for, I think kind of pop up every 10 years or so. And we were in another one of those moments somewhere in the middle of this process. And this piece comes in that really is spinning out something I don't think a lot of people had thought about, which is, you know, when you have everything, what are you left longing for? What are you left that you need? And it tends to, you know, they spin this story that you come to at the end and you think, right, like, we still need human understanding and thought and connection and people to understand, you know, deep emotion and deep values. And the more I read that story, the more I kind of fell in love with it. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that this idea of the basic income is really underexplored in science fiction. I mean, there's a lot of futures like Star Trek or something where we're way past scarcity entirely. But it seems like I haven't read too many stories where it's just the very near future and they've just implemented this basic income and what are the immediate short-term implications of that. So it was really interesting for me to see the story for that reason.
Yeah, and to your point, you know, it was one of those pieces that just, it kind of came out of some wonderful left field. It didn't take on technology. It didn't take on, you know, the ever connected world. It just, right, pulled this thought out of conversation and ran with it. And I love thinking about how an author's mind does that, you know, just probably comes up with a sentence or a what if, and then just gets to start spinning out that thread. That's how I felt about that piece.
Well, there are a lot of stories in this issue, though, that deal with technology, and particularly technology that reads your mind or that is paying a lot of attention to what you are thinking or what you want is a theme that just shows up in a number of the different stories.
Mm-hmm. You know, there was a couple of pieces where I would be reading, and I know that the story ultimately is heartbreaking or anxiety producing, but they would just make me laugh because there would be these moments and lines. And I know the author's very skillful at doing that, which it's a really hard thing to do, right? But both Charlie Jane Anders and Charles Yu's piece both spin out a kind of anxiety around technology and the reading of our minds in different ways. And I think that they balance each other really well. Charles Yu, it was fun to have that piece because right as we were producing it, you know, Westworld was all the talk. And he's a top writer there. And I started watching Westworld and then thinking about how, you know, how does his mind go to this other thing, which is like the creation of this technology that can actually literally read our thoughts and show it to us on our screen before we even kind of have those thoughts, or as we're having them. And how do we stop that? How do we manage that? And I don't know, it was kind of fun to put it in context of where Westworld was going and try to figure out if there was any threads or, you know, or somebody who's working on a show like Westworld has any time to do something like this.
Well, it was funny because, you know, I've interviewed Charles Yu, and so I know a little bit about his biography, and there appeared to be some autobiographical elements in that story. And so I was wondering how close that is to his inner monologue. And if so, I just want to give him a hug because...
Oh, well, you know, I want to ask you about that. What do you think? Because you've interviewed him. That was a piece that Adam Rogers brought in and edited. And, you know, all I did was shepherd it through and point out little bits here and there just to make sure that we were keeping the readers with us. But that piece barely needed any editing at all. I think the only thing we had to do was ask him to cut a couple hundred words to fit the page.
No, I mean, my impression is that that's pretty close. I mean, you know, you'd have to ask him, but he's very, very self-effacing. And so, yeah, that seemed to fit pretty well with how I see his personality.
What I loved about that piece, too, is it's not easy reading necessarily, and same with Jemison's piece. And I like that we got a few kind of harder science fiction short stories into the magazine. So back to what we were talking about earlier, the range of themes and lengths and tones. I'm just very proud of the range because some pieces are more literary, some pieces are really based in genre, and the Yu and the Jemison in particular felt to me like kind of core Wired stories, in that they were a bit harder, they reward multiple reads, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, there was sort of a variety in terms of the storytelling techniques too, because you mentioned the Jemison story is sort of on these transcripts of these communiques. And then there's the story, The Current Entertainments, which is written as a kind of theater review from the future.
Yeah.
I don't know, what's the story behind that one?
So that's another piece that came in from Adam Rogers, commissioned that piece. And I think most readers of other magazines will notice that that piece is essentially directly taking on the New Yorker and Anthony Lane and the Anthony Lane style of film review, which, you know, is so unique and so delightful. And I think, you know, Adam and the author just decided, what's that look like in 75 years or 50 years? And then I actually think that they decided together, I think Adam may have thrown out the idea of making this actually a Condé Nast bot in the end. If you see the little note at the very end, that it turns out that the author is just it's just a self-generated
I love that
review.
so much.
I know, which was a fun twist because here we are, you know, actually in its conception, taking on a real person who does like really thoughtful work and has this very specific voice. And then it turns out in the end, that we have just worked ourselves out of a job on all aspects of the, you know, of the future.
Right. And so what's going on in the story, if I got it all right, is that some sort of performance artist has robbed a bank wearing something that's recording his memories. And so then this guy is reviewing that recording as a, you know, full sensory experience in an extraordinarily pompous, you know, condescending way, and comparing it to all these classic works of art and saying that this is just doesn't measure up. So, and it's just very funny in that way.
It's very funny. I mean, I think it's that, right, in the future, that this is the future of film, right? That it's a full 360-degree experience in which you can see their thoughts, read their thoughts, also see you're sort of with the bank robber. In my imagination, you're somehow just immersed in that film as if it's suddenly, I don't know, you're kind of a viewing character of a film. And, you know, that's what our entertainment will look like in the future. And then just how terrible the outcomes can be when people try to apply it to film genre. That piece is very funny. I mean, it is one of those pieces you might have to read once or twice, which I actually never like to ask somebody to do but it's more that you get more out of it when you read it a couple of times and it becomes funnier and funnier.
I think I've always thought the mark of a good short story was one that rewards multiple readings, and that's certainly true of this issue. But an interesting fact about about that story, I think we were originally going to put Anthony Lane's name on the story to really hit home the fact that this was sort of satirizing him. But a couple of us felt, and I hope Glenn David Gold doesn't mind my saying this, that the style wasn't quite Anthony Lanean. He's such a singular, inimitable stylist that this didn't seem to be an exact replica of Anthony Lane's style. But then you get to the end and you see that it's a bot. And so I sort of like this secondary layer. I don't know if I'm reading too much into it, that, you know, you can't in the end perfectly replicate a human. This is really just a bot trying to be a reviewer in some way. So that's sort of the reading I took away after a couple of times.
Well, I mean, you mentioned that a couple of these stories were brought in by Adam Rogers, and there's kind of an interesting note on the story first from him about how this story came about. Could you talk about that?
Yes, that's one of my favorite moments in this whole issue. So Adam, years ago, when his son was about 5, he told his son that we had left the Curiosity rover behind on Mars, that it was, you know, an unmanned craft. And his son was so upset because he was just at that age where he could understand enough, but not understand that didn't mean we left, you know, a human being behind. And he, you know, I don't know, it might have hit him at a moment where it just tugged at his heart somehow, and his son was just distraught. So Adam took to Twitter and asked people, you know, with a distraught son, what do I do? What do I tell him? And Adam has a lot of writer friends and fiction writer friends. And John Rogers just said, wait, hang on a second, I'll get back to you. And within, I don't know how much time, but it really wasn't that much time, he wrote him this piece. And this piece, and I think Adam's probably be annoyed that I'm telling this much of the story, but the piece was basically a bit of an homage to answer and to help his son understand. And to me, it's so sweet because originally in the first draft, the first initial of the main character was the same initial as Adam's son. And, it basically is saying like, you're the hero who's going to go get him back. And so when I knew that and could read that into the story, and a couple of us really pushed to have that editor's note in there so that the readers would see that there was multiple layers going on here.
I'm pretty sure, didn't it come just as an email or something? It wasn't even like typed up in a Word doc. It was literally just an email.
I think so. I think he just emailed him the story a few days, a few hours, a day or so later.
Maria was talking about earlier that the issue felt pretty dystopian, and we were kind of worried about that. And so we wanted to inject a bit of optimism into the mix. So we were considering a couple of optimistic pieces sort of later in the game, and that was one of them. And I think everybody read it and sort of knew right away that had to be in the issue. Because it was so touching. And I think I teared up reading it. And it was, like I said, it just came in as an email that I was probably reading on my phone on the way home from work as we're all stressed trying to, get another piece in the magazine that sort of rounds out the mix and lifts up the mood a bit.
And actually the way that worked was that we were talking about this, like we were talking about how we have a lot of dark stories, and Adam said, I think Rob had talked to Adam and I was talking to Adam, and Adam said, well, I might have something. And he just kind of forwarded this email along to a handful of us, and everybody was just like, okay, done. That's lovely.
And it's so great. And it speaks to we all have this tendency to anthropomorphize these space rovers, Curiosity, Opportunity, any of these things we send into space. Yeah, we just love pretending they're humans, and of course they tweet things. So that story, even though it was written years ago, kind of speaks to this very much a contemporary idea that we send these robots into space and we kind of pretend that they have feelings.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to ask you guys about the cover, because so the cover, if you haven't seen it, it depicts these two figures standing in sort of a placid blue universe, looking through a dark portal from which sinister red light is flowing forth. Now, am I reading too much into it to read any sort of political message into that color scheme?
Well, interestingly enough, if you look at that cover, the light is actually coming from behind the women, right? Because their shadows go into the dark portal. One of the things about the art that I mentioned at the beginning, that it was so fun and just great to work with our art department. So David Moretti had produced he had produced a fiction issue of Wired when he worked for Wired Italia. He's this wonderful, rich, deeply thoughtful, and passionate Italian, our creative director. And he wanted to make this whole issue just feel a bit like a book, like you were holding a book. And so he redesigned the entire structure of the magazine and used a paper design behind each issue that actually grows on itself. And he and Allie Fisher, who is another one of our wonderful designers, found these two sisters that create this kind of end paper. And so if you're flipping through the book, you realize like the end papers behind each story actually build on each other, and they're all algorithmically built. So at the end, they were talking to a handful of their favorite designers and came up with this cover. And I think it just did work. I mean, when we knew Trump was the president, we knew that our future was much more uncertain. And this cover just said it all. I mean, I don't want to read too much political into it, but it did feel right.
Everyone who I've brought up the issue to has the first thing they say is the cover is amazing. And it really is tremendous.
I had a couple other random questions I kind of want to ask you guys about the magazine, but is there anything else? Do you have any just final thoughts, I guess, about this fiction issue, or just anything else you didn't get a chance to mention?
I did want to say that it did feel very, being in most of the time the nonfiction magazine world and having such a big news event like the Trump election happen, I know a lot of people in other magazines who were tearing up their magazines and having to rewrite stories. And it was really an interesting moment to realize that, again, there was a lot of anxiety happening through the year, and I think a lot of our authors have felt that. But it was very interesting to look at what we had and feel like, this is a good moment to give people both a little bit of respite from this very anxious year, but also to give them just something that's, did this great thing that we all love, which is fiction authors spinning out ideas. And so I felt really happy that we had this in hand to give to our readers. It felt right. It felt right in a very tough news year, no matter what side of the fence you stand on.
Jason, final thoughts?
Oh, I think Maria said it beautifully. Yeah, I've been at Wired for almost 5 years, and it's one of the issues I'm certainly proudest of. And I think Tor reviewed the issue and opened by saying something like, in a year that's seen Wired become increasingly literary. And I really liked that for some reason, in part because for the website, Peter, the culture editor, and I run the Wired Book Club, and so that started up, I think, back in May, sort of right along the time that Caitlyn was dreaming up this issue, and some of the authors that we've read for Book Club, like Nora Jemisin, were in the issue, and so I think, like I was saying earlier, it's an exciting time for genre, particularly science fiction, tackling and fantasy, tackling these very relevant contemporary themes. And like Maria said, it was sort of perfect that we had this issue come along at just the time when it felt like we needed it. And so I don't know if that's just us reading too much into things or it just really happening the way it was supposed to happen. But, I don't know. Yeah, it all sort of came together in the way that only magazines kind of do come together. There was a lot of stress, and we had to hold some pieces and put others online and really think about the mix and what belonged in the magazine and how they all work together. And I think that what we came up with really works. So I'm just, very proud of it.
I mean, do you want to say anything else about the Wired Book Club? Because I think that's something our listeners would probably be interested in.
Oh, sure. I mean, it sort of occurred to us that we didn't have a really robust coverage of science fiction and fantasy. And that's something that I'm very passionate about and want to write about more. So back in May, Katie, who runs the science vertical, Peter, who runs the culture vertical, we call the web sections verticals, really jargony. Section is a better word. And me, who mainly works on the print magazine, thought to force us to sort of cover science fiction and fantasy in a more regular way, we should start a Wired Book Club where we pick a book that's roughly newish, come out in the last couple of years, and every week host a little discussion about the section that we'd read and try to incorporate reader feedback and reader comments, and at the end of the month talk to the author. And I don't know how many readers out there are participating in the book club, but we certainly hear from a few of them, especially when we, take off a month and people wonder, where's Wired Book Club? So that's always gratifying. It's been a lot of fun, and we've had a lot of interest, and I don't know, it's nice to engage with writers. Every month we have a conversation with an exciting writer in genre, and it's really, I think, deepened our coverage of books. And now we're tying in pieces with the magazine. Especially next year, we're going to try to do some kind of cross-promotional stuff where in the print magazine, we'll do maybe an author interview, and then that same month read one of their books for the website. So, I don't know, it's made us feel more part of that world. And like I keep saying, it's a really exciting time for genre for whatever reason. And I don't know, it's nice to be part of it. And now that we have the fiction issue, I feel like we're firmly back in the book world.
Can you say what any of the books coming up that you'll be reading are?
Oh, sure. We haven't officially released the list, but we do know that we're thinking about Infomocracy, which is Malka Older's book, came out this year, and she has a piece in the fiction issue. And we read Ada Palmer's book this year, Too Like the Lightning, which my favorite book that we've done for Wired Book Club so far, and we we're potentially going to publish something of hers in the fiction issue. That didn't quite work out. But we love that book so much, and I hear that Infomocracy is very much kind of a companion to that book in that it's about a future run by corporations. So I'm very excited to do that. Nnedi Okorafor won the Hugo this year for her novella Binti, so we're thinking of doing that in January. I don't want to say too much because we haven't officially committed to any of these books, but those are some of the ones we're thinking about doing. I can say that Kim Stanley Robinson and John Scalzi both published big standalone books in March, so you can probably expect we'll do one or both of them in the new year.
I was also just looking at your reviews of absurd self-published ebooks.
Yes, one of my favorite series. Maria, did you ever know I did that?
No.
There was this Tumblr called Kindle Cover Disasters from a couple of years ago, where the Tumblr was just these, covers that probably people designed on, I don't know, Microsoft Paint or Photoshop or something. Really atrocious covers, but kind of amazing at the same time for their self-published genre fiction. And it was sort of poking fun at these writers, but then I thought, like, maybe we should dignify this. Let's not just make fun of these books. Let's read the books that Kindle Cover Disasters is spotlighting. So I started reading some of these stories, these completely self-published books, and tried to review them in a way that wasn't exactly making fun of self-published writers, but sort of celebrating the art form, which is very much an art form. So I had a series for a little while, but it was sort of not sustainable because I couldn't every single month read one of these stories. It's not great for the health.
Well, I liked the title, Now That I'm a Ghost, I'm Gay.
Yes, that's the one I went out on.
You say...
a classic of the form, really.
Yeah, so I this is the first paragraph. It says, the most painful event of my life was slowly admitting to myself that I was gay. The second most painful event of my life was probably getting thrown off my bike by a speeding pickup truck on the scenic route around campus into a tree that shattered my skull and killed me.
Mm-hmm. And so begins a 11,000 word, I think, self-published story about, I think his name is Jason, if I'm remembering correctly, which was an odd resonance. He's killed, never really realizing his homosexuality, and I'm gay as well, if that's relevant. And he, as a ghost, comes back, or maybe he's sleeping with his friend Jason. Point is, there's ghost sex. He realizes he's gay when he becomes a ghost. I highly recommend it to anyone who has a half an hour. But it's, of course, an absurd story at the same time. So the point of these reviews was the fact that the book is called Now That I'm a Ghost, I'm Gay is well, do with that what you will.
And then I just also really wanted to ask you, you mentioned that President Obama edited an issue of Wired magazine a couple months ago. I was just curious if you had, what that was like, or if you guys were involved with that at all, or just if you had any perspective on that.
Well, Jason and I were both involved because we're both editors on the print magazine. We weren't the first team, the first line of defense that would go to the White House every so often. That would be Scott and Rob and Caitlyn and Adam in the beginning, Caitlyn Roper and Adam Rogers. And then it pared down to a handful of us working through, as we would any issue, but with a lot of back and forth with the White House Policy Office and the team of people we were working with there. Rob actually did a lot of the direct relationship building with them. But, it was a super interesting and wild thing that we did that Scott started. I mean, it was an idea Scott had early on, and he just he went after it and he got it. And he had seen a kindred spirit in Obama right when Scott took over the editorship of Wired. He could really recognize a lot of the language that the president would use as far as what the future could hold, and that that it is well within our grasp to have a very optimistic future, and that those were the ideas the president was very interested in, and that just sits sort of squarely in what Scott believes and what Wired tries to focus on. And so to him, it wasn't ever going to be political. It wasn't going to be about trying to get people elected to office. It was going to be about science and technology and potential. So Scott and Rob went back and forth with the team from the White House on ideas and people to cover. And then they really, the White House really let us do the editing and the writing work, which was appropriate. Is there any sort of specific question you have about?
Well, obviously the thing I'm most curious about is who asked him about his favorite science fiction movies and just how that came about.
I think Caitlyn, actually. Yeah.
Yeah.
She's tremendous. One of the most brilliant magazine editors, certainly, that I know. But yeah, she spearheaded the book recommendations and the movie recommendations. So she was back and forth with his office and on those.
Cool. I also thought it was interesting that, it was reported within the last year or two that Obama was reading The Three-Body Problem on his Christmas break.
Right.
So I just like having a president who reads science fiction. That's very edifying for me.
Yes.
I actually don't think I knew that. That's amazing.
Yeah.
And we, of course, did Three-Body Problem for book club.
It's also really fun for me to learn little things about the president that I didn't know, which was, that he was a big Star Trek fan and that he has this great list of science fiction.
It's so funny to me that his favorite movie of the year was The Martian, but not like he said that multiple times. That was the main takeaway from several meetings, was that Obama freaking loves The Martian, which I think appears at least 2, maybe 3 times in that issue.
All right, so we're pretty much out of time. So are there any other final thoughts you want to mention?
I'm sure once I get off the phone, I'll feel like there was about 30 things I wish I had said. One other thing that I do just kind of want to add is that if people are able to get their hands on the actual print issue, there are so many little gifts from the art department. Like at the very beginning of the magazine, they added in these little 3-panel self-contained fiction stories to a number of the pages in the front of the magazine. Like there's one underneath the editor's letter by the author. The illustrator's name is Anjud Shrestha. And then there's another one farther into the magazine on the page of comments that, again, they're just 3-panel little graphic illustrations, but they're self-contained fiction stories. And I just love that the print issue of this magazine, again, is so beautiful and is built like a book of short stories with a spine on every single issue, and then closes again with this beautiful self-contained story in a piece of art. So if anybody does have a chance to get their hands on the print issue, they'll be well rewarded.
The flip side of that, of course, is that there are on Wired.com additional stories that we couldn't run in the magazine. I think it's 4 extra stories, all of which are certainly worth reading. So there's advantages to both mediums here. And to add to what Maria was saying, the table of contents I love so much. The designer did something where taking the themes from all the stories and turning them into these little blobs of, I don't know, you'll just have to pick up the print magazine.
Yeah, it shows the table of contents pages show all of the cross themes that work across the magazine. So it's an extra little gift to the reader who's looking closely.
And the illustrations, everyone is by a different illustrators from all over the world. And they're really exceptional, every single one. And they're these full bleed illustrations. The colors are amazing, and they all kind of play into the colors within the text. So yeah, the experience of reading the issue, I hope, is one that's really rewarding.
All right, so pick up the print magazine. I think that's a good note to end on. And so we've been speaking with Maria Streshinsky and Jason Kehe. So guys, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks, it's been a pleasure.
And that was our panel. So big thanks again to Maria Streshinsky and Jason Kehe for joining us on the show. Special thanks as well to Thomas Mieksa, who just signed up this week to support us on Patreon. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time or fixed monthly contribution, you can do that via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. And I want to give a special thank you to Dale Baker, who just made a very generous contribution to the show via PayPal. Dale writes, "Hi, David. I found Geek's Guide when I went searching for Werner Vinge, been a fan of his for the last 30 years. Now I'm a devoted listener and really appreciate the high-quality interviews and discussion. Please keep up the good work. So big thanks again to Dale Baker for that nice note and for his generous support. And of course, a big thank you again to everyone out there who supported the podcast. We really appreciate it. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.